Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 567, A Discovery. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I am once again recording on a Thursday night so that I can get this out for you, even though it is Yom Kippur and my son Aaron is home. I am pounding this sucker out because I am pretty much guaranteed that tomorrow morning the same thing will happen here that happened last week. I recorded Thursday night, and thank goodness, because I woke up at 4:22 a.m. on Friday to a power outage that continued well into the workday. That was not something I want to do again. I now have a system set up, but that system will not include anything useful like being able to record. So here we are, recording on a Thursday night, and that's just fine. I am not, however, going to talk about anything crafty. Mostly my craftiness has been taken up with going for long walks in the morning across the Delaware River every single day for the last week and a half. It's what's keeping me sane because things are crazy. Along with the crazy, I want to send out a huge apology to Tara because Tara sent this voicemail in and I didn't catch it when it came.
Hello, Heather. This is not going to be my usual peppy message. I haven't listened to today's episode yet, and I got some pretty bad news from my mom. She is in hospital with COVID pneumonia. They are checking her O2 stats hourly, and if they improve, she gets to go home. However, I am in need of comfort food, and I imagine the rest of the Craftlit family is as well. And as we are rapidly moving into the cooler weather days, I was wondering if you could share your favorite / the best you've had so far matzo ball mix for matzo ball soup. I need comfort. I need matzo balls. Can you please share that information with the Craftlit family? And could you ask them to please send out any good juju they have? Because while my mother is stupid and did not get vaccinated, she can't get vaccinated now until March of next year. Because if you catch COVID and you survive or fight it off, you have to wait 6 months to get vaccinated. My dad isn't vaccinated. My sister, her fiance, and their child got COVID earlier this year, and they are not vaccinated. However, she is not, and I am asking for the goodness because I don't have the energy in me to send it right now, and I'm worried because she's not even 50 yet. So, I can't wait to listen to the chapters today. I keep waiting for like a really good dad joke to come in there because there's so many. I mean, the butler, chef's kiss, but she's not in the house currently. Good stuff. I hope you're having a better day than I am. And I hope the start of your new year is a good one.
All right. So, Tara, I am so sorry about all of this. I have lots of good news, including matzo ball news, even though it's a little late. The good news is if your state is currently telling you that your mother cannot get vaccinated against COVID for 6 months, they are talking out their butts. Because here I am on the CDC website reading the latest guidance, and here I'm going to read it to you. Can I get vaccinated against COVID-19 while I am currently sick with COVID? No, you cannot. people with COVID-19 who have symptoms should wait to be vaccinated until they've recovered from their illness and have met the criteria for discontinuing isolation. That means you have to be fever-free with your symptoms improving for the last 24 hours of your isolation period, which should be 10 days. So as long as you hit day 10, you're fever-free, you're symptom-free, or symptom improving, because the cough can take a while to improve. Taste and smell can take a long time to come back. So as long as you're fever-free, though, no active infection, that's the end of isolation. Once you're done with isolation, you can leave the house, you can go get a vaccination. They go on to say people who don't have symptoms, so they're tested positive but they are asymptomatic, should also wait until they meet the criteria before getting vaccinated. In their case, no symptoms. The criteria would be stay indoors for 10 days, stay away from people because that's your most likely span of infectiousness. And then it says this guidance also applies to people who get COVID-19 before getting their second dose of vaccine. Basically, what they're saying is don't go anywhere if you're infectious or potentially infectious. Wait until isolation is over. Then hustle your butt over to get a vaccination. It also says people who have had a known COVID-19 exposure should not go get vaccinated until their quarantine period has ended. Same reason. If you are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, so you've been exposed, but you haven't gotten symptoms yet, or you're one of the lucky people who isn't going to get symptoms, then you really shouldn't be leaving the house until you've hit that point in time at which the chances of you being infectious and having a case of COVID that is going to potentially hurt other people is pretty much nil. It goes on to say this recommendation also applies to people with a known COVID exposure who've received their first dose of an mRNA vaccine, but not their second. So the same thing. Stay home until you're no longer infectious or potentially infectious, then go get vaccinated. Everything I have heard from my geeky virologists has made it pretty clear there has been zero negative effects of getting a vaccine after having COVID. When there are issues with getting a vaccine after getting COVID is if you've been treated with monoclonal antibodies, which are awesome. And if you get sick, you know you have COVID and you have risk factors, do everything you can to get treated with monoclonal antibodies. They are excellent if you get them right away. They are not going to help you if you are on a ventilator. I think the geeky virologist said ventilator time is when you want steroids because you need the anti-inflammatories prior to that. And I know the nurses who are listening will correct me if I'm wrong on that, so wait until next week to hear. And the monoclonals are the early attack formation. So with monoclonals, and you'd have to look it up because I don't know if your mom got monoclonals or not. That is how you'd want to play that. If you need to come to Pennsylvania in order to get a vaccination, just let me know, and I will find a site that is closer to you than I am. However, all of that aside, matzo balls. I have found that any matzo ball mix has been really good. Strites, Manischewitz being the two most frequently found. Both excellent, nicely spiced, not too salty. I am going to put Grandma Carol's matzo ball recipe into the show notes for you. I highly suggest you spice them up with whatever you like, whether it's a season-all kind of salt thing or just herbiness, whatever. They could use some. I think the salt that's recommended for the recipe is not quite enough, but here's the secret. And this is, boy, is this going to start a riot. Within the community, within the tribe, there are two camps. There are you need to scoop the matzo ball mix out of the bowl, put it in one hand, and then roll it like you're making a snickerdoodle into a nice compact ball. And then you plop those suckers into your soup to cook them as the soup is boiling, or at least simmering towards the end of the soupiness. And then you can take them out, by the way, of the soup and stick them. I like to use an empty egg carton that I line with cling wrap. And then I put the matzo balls in the cling wrap in those little pockets. And then you can refrigerate them and or freeze them for future use. Not everybody knows that. But there is the roll it into a ball, stick it in the water or the soup and cook it that way camp. And then there is the, oh dear God, no, those turn into rocks. What you want to do is take like maybe an ice cream scoop or 2 big spoons and lift out a reasonably ball-shaped blob of matzo ball mix, all mixed up together. Because there's egg in there and there's, all the schmutz. Don't compress. You can kind of lightly shape it if you don't want little chunks of it falling off, but really lightly, light touch. And then you gently put those into the simmering soup and let them cook that way. So the 2 camps are very round, beautiful, but often very dense matzo balls, or doesn't necessarily look like ball, looks a little more like dumpling blob, but light and fluffy. So, depending on which way you want to go, those are your 2 choices. I highly recommend trying both of them because honestly, any matzo ball, when you need comfort food, is a good matzo ball. And if you've never had matzo ball soup before, basically make a really good chicken soup, and then it's a particular kind of dumpling that you mix up and put in. So there's that. Oh, and always, always, always add, preferably, caramelized onions, or at least cooked onions. That is coming from the boys that are sliced super crazy thin. That's their preference. All right. All of that said, Tara then left a second voicemail. Here it is.
Hello, Heather. It is I, Tara Worcester, with a good news update. I talked to my mom yesterday, and I've spoken to her again this morning. She is doing so much better. She is off O2. She is off the meds, and she might be going home by 4 p.m. today. It's Sunday, the 12th. Hi, I'm an adult and I have a calendar. I can't put days anymore. The 12th. Yes, it is the 12th today. And I've listened to the episode. So much shit's happening between those sisters. I want to know what's what. Anywho, I'm going to fold laundry and try not to worry and go enjoy my Sunday. I hope you had a great weekend, Heather. I hope you have a very easy week.
All right, so thank God. Tara, I am so relieved because I literally almost choked when I heard your voicemail tonight as I was getting ready to record, because my ops supervisor just entered the hospital with COVID pneumonia. She's 24, and I talked to her on the phone today. She sounded better, but she said at one point, all right, I'm going to have to get off the phone because I have to go do lung physical therapy. And I thought, all right, that cannot be great for a 24-year-old to have to do that. So, once again, the thing's no joke. Get a vaccine, wear a mask. Holy cow. The number of stories that I hear daily, it's just real frustrating, actually, is what it is. The virus is so good at being a virus. It's like when you read about plagues, actual historical plagues, and you go, wow, that really traveled fast. Yes, well, it was a very good virus. And here now we get to see one too. Yay. All right. So the real balm for our souls, we all know, is the Leavenworth case. So hopping to it. Today's 3 chapters, chapters 9, 10, and 11, are going to, in some parts, feel a little staid, a little traditional, a little kind of old-fashioned, oh, why me kind of stuff. And yes, that's true, and it happens. So we'll just deal with it and get over it. That said, there's some interesting information we're going to get about the relationship between Mary and Eleanor. We're going to get to see quite a bit more of Mary. We're going to hear quite a bit more about Eleanor. And we're going to get more intel, some, on Hannah, the mysterious Hannah. You are going to hear from a Mr. Fobbs. He's one of Mr. Grice's detectives. And there's a point in the story where I got very confused as to who we were talking about when a Miss Leavenworth enters. It's Mary. We almost entirely are Mary in these chapters. We get, just like in Northanger Abbey, there was a moment where I talked about letters, the directions on a letter. What we would call addressing a letter was directing a letter. You are hearing today about a letter with directions and somebody who puts the directions face down. So you'll be able to listen for that. Mr. Veely. You're going to hear a reference to Mr. Veely again, and it's been a while since we've talked about him. Mr. Raymond, our narrator, is a lawyer who works for Mr. Veely. Mr. Veely is actually the person who knew Mr. Leavenworth and happened to be out of town. So we're going to get a little bit more info filling us in on what's up with Mr. Veely. And ultimately, by the end of the chapters today, I think you will probably be left with more questions than you got answers for. And that, at this point in the story, is just fine. All right, so let's listen to chapters 9, 10, and 11 of The Leavenworth Case, written by Anna Catherine Green, read for us by Kevin Green of LibriVox, and what a treat it is to have him read this to us. Here we go.
Chapter 9. A Discovery. His rolling eyes did never rest in place, but walked each where for fear of hid mischance, holding a lattice still before his pace, through which he still did peep, as forward he did pace. Fairy Queen. Miss Leavenworth, who appeared to have lingered from a vague terror of everything and everybody in the house not under her immediate observation, shrank from my side the moment she found herself left comparatively alone, and, retiring to a distant corner, gave herself up to grief. Turning my attention, therefore, in the direction of Mr. Gryce, I found that person busily engaged in counting his own fingers, with a troubled expression upon his countenance, which may or may not have been the result of that arduous employment. But at my approach, satisfied perhaps that he possessed no more than the requisite number, he dropped his hands and greeted me with a faint smile, which was, considering all things, too suggestive to be pleasant. "Well," said I, taking my stand before him, "I cannot blame you. You had a right to do as you thought best. But how had you the heart? Was she not sufficiently compromised about your bringing out that wretched handkerchief, which she may or may not have dropped in that room, but whose presence there, soiled though it was with pistol grease, is certainly no proof that she herself was connected with this murder?" "Mr. Raymond," he returned, "I have been detailed as police officer and detective to look after this case, and I propose to do it." "Of course," I hastened to reply, "I am the last man to wish you to shirk your duty, but you cannot have the temerity to declare that this young and tender creature can by any possibility be considered as at all likely to be implicated in a crime so monstrous and unnatural. The mere assertion of another woman's suspicions on the subject ought not to—" But here Mr. Gryce interrupted me. "You talk when your attention should be directed to more important matters. That other woman, as you are pleased to designate the fairest ornament of New York society, sits over there in tears. Go and comfort her." Looking at him in amazement, I hesitated to comply, but seeing he was in earnest, crossed to Mary Leavenworth and sat down by her side. She was weeping, but in a slow, unconscious way, as if grief had been mastered by fear. The fear was too undisguised, and the grief too natural, for me to doubt the genuineness of either. "Miss Leavenworth," said I, "any attempt at consolation on the part of a stranger must seem at a time like this the most bitter of mockeries, but do try and consider that circumstantial evidence is not always absolute proof." Starting with surprise, she turned her eyes upon me with a slow, comprehensive gaze, wonderful to see in orbs so tender and womanly. "No," she repeated, "circumstantial evidence is not absolute proof. But Eleanor does not know this. She is so intense. She cannot see but one thing at a time. She has been running her head into a noose, and oh!" Pausing, she clutched at my arm with a passionate grasp. "Do you think there is any danger? Will they—" She could not go on. "Miss Leavenworth," I protested, with a warning look towards the detective, "what do you mean?" Like a flash, her glance followed mine, an instant change taking place in her bearing. "Your cousin may be intense," I went on, as if nothing had occurred, "but I do not know to what you refer when you say she has been running her head into a noose." "I mean this," she firmly returned, "that, wittingly or unwittingly, she has so parried and met the questions which have been put to her in this room that any one listening to her would give her the credit of knowing more than she ought to of this horrible affair." "She acts," Mary whispered, but not so low but that every word could be distinctly heard in all quarters of the room, "as if she were anxious to conceal something. But she is not. I am sure she is not. Eleanor and I are not good friends, but all the world can never make me believe she has any more knowledge of this murder than I have. Won't somebody tell her, then, won't you, that her manner is a mistake, that it is calculated to arouse suspicion, that it has already done so? And, oh, don't forget to add," her voice sinking to a decided whisper now, "what you have just repeated to me, that circumstantial evidence is not always absolute proof." I surveyed her with great astonishment. What an actress this woman was! "You request me to tell her this," said I. "Wouldn't it be better for you to speak to her yourself?" "Eleanor and I hold little or no confidential communication," she replied. I could easily believe this, and yet I was puzzled. Indeed, there was something incomprehensible in her whole manner. Not knowing what else to say, I remarked, "That is unfortunate. She ought to be told that the straightforward course is the best, by all means." Miss Leavenworth only wept. "Oh, why has this awful trouble come to me, who have always been so happy before?" "Perhaps for the very reason that you have always been so happy." "It was not enough for dear uncle to die in this horrible manner, but she, my own cousin, had to—" I touched her arm, and the action seemed to recall her to herself. Stopping short, she bit her lip. "Miss Leavenworth," I whispered, "you should hope for the best. Besides, I honestly believe you to be disturbing yourself unnecessarily. If nothing fresh transpires, a mere prevarication or so of your cousin's will not suffice to injure her." I said this to see if she had any reason to doubt the future. I was amply rewarded. "Anything fresh? How could there be anything fresh when she is perfectly innocent?" Suddenly a thought seemed to strike her. Wheeling round in her seat till her lovely perfumed wrapper brushed my knee, she asked, "Why didn't they ask me more questions? I could have told them Eleanor never left her room last night." "You could?" What was I to think of this woman? "Yes. My room is nearer the head of the stairs than hers. If she had passed my door, I should have heard her, don't you see?" Ah, that was all. "That does not follow," I answered sadly. "Can you give no other reason?" "I would say whatever was necessary," she whispered. I started back. Yes, this woman would lie now to save her cousin; had lied during the inquest. But then I felt grateful, and now I was simply horrified. "Miss Leavenworth," said I, "nothing can justify one in violating the dictates of his own conscience, not even the safety of one we do not altogether love." "No?" she returned, and her lip took a tremulous curve. The lovely bosom heaved, and she softly looked away. If Eleanor's beauty had made less of an impression on my fancy, or her frightful situation awakened less anxiety in my breast, I should have been a lost man from that moment. "I did not mean to do anything very wrong," Miss Leavenworth continued. "Do not think too badly of me." "No, no," said I, and there is not a man living who would not have said the same in my place. What more might have passed between us on the subject I cannot say, for just then the door opened and a man entered whom I recognized as the one who had followed Eleanor Leavenworth out a short time before. "Mr. Gryce," said he, pausing just inside the door, "a word, if you please." The detective nodded, but did not hasten towards him. Instead of that, he walked deliberately away to the other end of the room, where he lifted the lid of an inkstand he saw there, muttered some unintelligible words into it, and speedily shut it again. Immediately the uncanny fancy seized me that if I should leap to that inkstand, open it and peer in, I should surprise and capture the bit of confidence he had entrusted to it. But I restrained my foolish impulse, and contented myself with noting the subdued look of respect with which the gaunt subordinate watched the approach of his superior. "Well?" inquired the latter as he reached him. "What now?" The man shrugged his shoulders and drew his principal through the open door. Once in the hall their voices sank to a whisper, and as their backs were only visible, I turned to look at my companion. She was pale but composed. "Has he come from Eleanor?" "I do not know. I fear so, Miss Leavenworth," I proceeded. "Can it be possible that your cousin has anything in her possession she desires to conceal?" "Then you think she is trying to conceal something?" "I do not say so, but there was considerable talk about a paper." "They will never find any paper or anything else suspicious in Eleanor's possession," Mary interrupted. "In the first place, there was no paper of importance enough" I saw Mr. Gryce's form suddenly stiffen "for any one to attempt its abstraction and concealment." "Can you be sure of that? May not your cousin be acquainted with something?" "There was nothing to be acquainted with, Mr. Raymond. We lived the most methodical and domestic of lives. I cannot understand, for my part, why so much should be made out of this. My uncle undoubtedly came to his death by the hand of some intended burglar. That nothing was stolen from the house is no proof that a burglar never entered it. As for the doors and windows being locked, will you take the word of an Irish servant as infallible upon such an important point? I cannot. I believe the assassin to be one of a gang who make their living by breaking into houses, and if you cannot honestly agree with me, do try and consider such an explanation as possible, if not for the sake of the family credit. Why then," and she turned her face with all its fair beauty upon mine, eyes, cheeks, mouth, all so exquisite and winsome, "why then, for mine." Instantly Mr. Gryce turned towards us. "Mr. Raymond, will you be kind enough to step this way?" Glad to escape from my present position, I hastily obeyed. "What has happened?" I asked. "We propose to take you into our confidence," was the easy response. "Mr. Raymond, Mr. Fobbs." I bowed to the man I saw before me, and stood uneasily waiting. Anxious as I was to know what we really had to fear, I still intuitively shrank from any communication with one whom I looked upon as a spy. "A matter of some importance," resumed the detective. "It is not necessary for me to remind you that it is in confidence, is it?" "No." "I thought not. Mr. Fobbs, you may proceed." Instantly the whole appearance of the man Fobbs changed. Assuming an expression of lofty importance, he laid his large hand outspread upon his heart and commenced: "Detailed by Mr. Gryce to watch the movements of Miss Eleanor Leavenworth, I left this room upon her departure from it, and followed her and the two servants who conducted her upstairs to her own apartment. Once there—" Mr. Gryce interrupted him. "Once there? Where?" "Her own room, sir." "Where situated?" "At the head of the stairs." "That is not her room. Go on." "Not her room? Then it was the fire she was after," he cried, clapping himself on the knee. The fire? Excuse me, I am ahead of my story. She did not appear to notice me much, though I was right behind her. It was not until she had reached the door of this room, which was not her room, he interpolated dramatically, and turned to dismiss her servants, that she seemed conscious of having been followed. Eyeing me then with an air of great dignity, quickly eclipsed, however, by an expression of patient endurance, she walked in, leaving the door open behind her in a courteous way I cannot sufficiently commend. I could not help frowning. Honest as the man appeared, this was evidently anything but a sore subject with him. Observing me frown, he softened his manner. Not seeing any other way of keeping her under my eye except by entering the room, I followed her in, and took a seat in a remote corner. She flashed one look at me as I did so, and commenced pacing the floor in a restless kind of way I am not altogether unused to. At last she stopped abruptly, right in the middle of the room. "Get me a glass of water," she gasped. "I'm faint again. Quick! On the stand in the corner." Now, in order to get that glass of water, it was necessary for me to pass behind a dressing mirror that reached almost to the ceiling, and I naturally hesitated. But she turned and looked at me, and well, gentlemen, I think either of you would have hastened to do what she asked, or at least, with a doubtful look at Mr. Gryce, have given your 2 ears for the privilege, even if you didn't succumb to the temptation. "Well, well," exclaimed Mr. Gryce impatiently. "I'm going on," said he. I stepped out of sight, then for a moment, but it seemed long enough for her purpose, for when I emerged, glass in hand, she was kneeling at the grate full 5 feet from the spot where she had been standing, and was fumbling with the waist of her dress in a way to convince me she had something concealed there which she was anxious to dispose of. I eyed her pretty closely as I handed her the glass of water, but she was gazing into the grate and didn't appear to notice. Drinking barely a drop, she gave it back, and in another moment was holding out her hands over the fire. "Oh, I am so cold!" she cried. "So cold!" And I verily believe she was. At any rate, she shivered most naturally. But there were a few dying embers in the grate, and when I saw her thrust her hand again into the folds of her dress, I became distrustful of her intentions, and, drawing a step nearer, looked over her shoulder, when I distinctly saw her drop something into the grate that clinked as it fell. Suspecting what it was, I was about to interfere, when she sprang to her feet, seized the scuttle of coal that was upon the hearth, and with one move emptied the whole upon the dying embers. "I want a fire!" she cried. "A fire!" "That is hardly the way to make one," I returned, carefully taking the coal out with my hands piece by piece, and putting it back into the scuttle. "Till what?" I asked, seeing him and Mr. Gryce exchange a hurried look. "Till I found this," opening a large hand and showing me a broken-handled key. Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Mr. Gryce receives new impetus. There's nothing ill can dwell in such a temple. Tempest. This astounding discovery made a most unhappy impression upon me. It was true, then. Eleanor the beautiful, the lovesome, was I could not finish the sentence, even in the silence of my own mind. "You look surprised," said Mr. Gryce, glancing curiously towards the key. "Now, I ain't. A woman does not thrill, blush, equivocate, and faint for nothing, especially such a woman as Miss Leavenworth." "A woman who could do such a deed would be the last to thrill, equivocate, and faint," I retorted. "Give me the key. Let me see it." He complacently put it in my hand. "It is the one we want. No getting out of that." I returned it. "If she declares herself innocent, I will believe her." He stared with great amazement. "You have strong faith in the women," he laughed. "I hope they will never disappoint you." I had no reply to this, and a short silence ensued, first broken by Mr. Gryce. "There is but one thing left to do," said he. "Fobbs, You will have to request Miss Leavenworth to come down. Do not alarm her, only see that she comes to the reception room," he added, as the man drew off. No sooner were we left alone than I made a move to return to Mary, but he stopped me. "Come and see it out," he whispered. "She will be down in a moment. See it out, you had best." Glancing back, I hesitated, but the prospect of beholding Eleanor again drew me in spite of myself. Telling him to wait, I returned to Mary's side to make my excuses. "What is the matter? What has occurred?" she breathlessly asked. "Nothing as yet to disturb you much. Do not be alarmed." But my face betrayed me. "There is something," said she. "Your cousin is coming down." "Down here?" and she shrank visibly. "No, to the reception room." "I do not understand. It is all dreadful, and no one tells me anything." "I pray God there may be nothing to tell. Judging from your present faith in your cousin, there will not be. Take comfort then, and be assured I will inform you if anything occurs which you ought to know." Giving her a look of encouragement, I left her crushed against the crimson pillows of the sofa on which she sat, and rejoined Mr. Gryce. We had scarcely entered the reception room when Eleanor Leavenworth came in. More languid than she was an hour before, but haughty still, she slowly advanced, and, meeting my eye, gently bent her head. "I have been summoned here," said she, directing herself exclusively to Mr. Gryce, "by an individual whom I take it to be in your employ. If so, may I request you to make your wishes known at once, as I am quite exhausted, and am in great need of rest." "Miss Leavenworth," returned Mr. Gryce, rubbing his hands together and staring in quite a fatherly manner at the door knob, "I am very sorry to trouble you, but the fact is, I wish to ask you—" But here she stopped him. "Anything in regard to the key which that man has doubtless told you he saw me drop into the ashes?" "Yes, miss." "Then I must refuse to answer any questions concerning it. I have nothing to say on the subject, unless it is this," giving him a look full of suffering, but full of a certain sort of courage too, "that he was right if he told you I had the key in hiding about my person, and that I attempted to conceal it in the ashes of the grate." "Still, miss—" But she had already withdrawn to the door. "I pray you to excuse me," said she. "No argument you could advance would make any difference in my determination. Therefore it would be but a waste of energy on your part to attempt any." And, with a flitting glance in my direction, not without its appeal, she quietly left the room. For a moment Mr. Gryce stood gazing after her with a look of great interest. Then, bowing with almost exaggerated homage, he hastily followed her out. I had scarcely recovered from the surprise occasioned by this unexpected movement, when a quick step was heard in the hall, and Mary, flushed and anxious, appeared at my side. "What is it?" she inquired. "What has Eleanor been saying?" "Alas," I answered, "she has not said anything. That is the trouble, Miss Leavenworth. Your cousin preserves a reticence upon certain points very painful to witness. She ought to understand that if she persists in doing this, that—" "That what?" There was no mistaking the deep anxiety prompting this question. "That she cannot avoid the trouble that will ensue." For a moment she stood gazing at me with great horror-stricken, incredulous eyes, then, sinking back into a chair, flung her hands over her face with the cry, "Oh, why were we ever born? Why were we allowed to live? Why did we not perish with those who gave us birth?" In the face of anguish like this, I could not keep still. "Dear Miss Leavenworth," I essayed, "there is no cause for such despair as this. The future looks dark, but not impenetrable. Your cousin will listen to reason, and in explaining—" But she, deaf to my words, had again risen to her feet, and stood before me in an attitude almost appalling. "Some women in my position would go mad, mad, mad!" I surveyed her with growing wonder. I thought I knew what she meant. She was conscious of having given the cue which had led to this suspicion of her cousin, and that in this way the trouble which hung over their heads was of her own making. I endeavored to soothe her, but my efforts were all unavailing. Absorbed in her own anguish, she paid but little attention to me. Satisfied at last that I could do nothing more for her, I turned to go. The movement seemed to arouse her. "I'm sorry to leave," said I, "without having afforded you any comfort. Believe me, I am very anxious to assist you. Is there no one I could send to your side, no woman friend or relative? It is sad to leave you alone in this house at such a time." "And do you expect me to remain here? Why, I should die! Here to-night!" And the long shudders shook her very frame. "It is not at all necessary for you to do so, Miss Leavenworth," broke in a bland voice over our shoulders. I turned with a start. Mr. Gryce was not only at our back, but had evidently been there for some moments. Seated near the door, one hand in his pocket, the other caressing the arm of his chair, he met our gaze with a sidelong smile that seemed at once to beg pardon for the intrusion, and to assure us it was made with no unworthy motive. "Everything will be properly looked after, miss. You can leave with perfect safety." I expected to see her resent this interference, but instead of that she manifested a certain satisfaction in beholding him there. Drawing me to one side, she whispered, "You think this Mr. Gryce very clever, do you not?" "Well," I cautiously replied, "he ought to be to hold the position he does. The authorities evidently repose great confidence in him." Stepping from my side as suddenly as she had approached it, she crossed the room and stood before Mr. Gryce. "Sir," said she, gazing at him with a glance of entreaty, "I hear you have great talents, that you can ferret out the real criminal from a score of doubtful characters, and that nothing can escape the penetration of your eye. If this is so, have pity on two orphan girls, suddenly bereft of their guardian and protector, and use your acknowledged skill in finding out who has committed this crime. It would be folly in me to endeavor to hide from you that my cousin, in her testimony, has given cause for suspicion, but I here declare her to be as innocent of wrong as I am, and I am only endeavoring to turn the eye of justice from the guiltless to the guilty, when I entreat you to look elsewhere for the culprit who committed this deed." Pausing, she held her two hands out before him. "It must have been some common burglar or desperado. Can you not bring him then to justice?" Her attitude was so touching, her whole appearance so earnest and appealing, that I saw Mr. Gryce's countenance brim with suppressed emotion, though his eye never left the coffee urn upon which it had fixed itself at her first approach. "You must find out. You can," she went on. "Hannah, the girl who is gone, must know all about it. Search for her, ransack the city, do anything. My property is at your disposal. I will offer a large reward for the detection of the burglar who did this deed." Mr. Gryce slowly rose. "Miss Leavenworth," he began, and stopped. The man was actually agitated. "Miss Leavenworth, I did not need your very touching appeal to incite me to my utmost duty in this case. Personal and professional pride were in themselves sufficient. But since you have honored me with this expression of your wishes, I will not conceal from you that I shall feel a certain increased interest in the affair from this hour. What mortal man can do, I will do, and if in 1 month from this day I do not come to you for my reward, Ebenezer Gryce is not the man I have always taken him to be." "And Eleanor?" "We will mention no names," said he, gently waving his hand to and fro. A few minutes later I left the house with Miss Leavenworth, she having expressed a wish to have me accompany her to the home of her friend, Mrs. Gilbert, with whom she had decided to take refuge. As we rolled down the street in the carriage Mr. Gryce had been kind enough to provide for us, I noticed my companion cast a look of regret behind her, as if she could not help feeling some compunctions at this desertion of her cousin. But this expression was soon changed for the alert look of one who dreads to see a certain face start up from some unknown quarter. Glancing up and down the street, peering furtively into doorways as we passed, starting and trembling if a sudden figure appeared on the curbstone. She did not seem to breathe with perfect ease till we had left the avenue behind us and entered upon 37th Street. Then, all at once, her natural colour returned, and, leaning gently towards me, she asked if I had a pencil and piece of paper I could give her. I fortunately possessed both. Handing them to her, I watched her with some little curiosity while she wrote 2 or 3 lines, wondering she could choose such a time and place for the purpose. "A little note I wish to send," she explained, glancing at the almost illegible scrawl with an expression of doubt. "Couldn't you stop the carriage a moment while I direct it?" I did so, and in another instant the leaf which I had torn from my note book was folded, directed, and sealed with a stamp which she had taken from her own pocket book. "This is a crazy looking epistle," she muttered, as she laid it, direction downwards, in her lap. "Why not wait then till you arrive at your destination, where you can seal it properly and direct it at your leisure?" "Because I am in haste. I wish to mail it now. Look, there is a box on the corner. Please ask the driver to stop once more." "Shall I not post it for you?" I asked, holding out my hand. But she shook her head, and without waiting for my assistance opened the door on her own side of the carriage and leapt to the ground. Even then she paused to glance up and down the street before venturing to drop her hastily written letter into the box. But when it had left her hand she looked brighter and more hopeful than I had yet seen her. And when, a few moments later, she turned to bid me good bye in front of her friend's house, it was with almost a cheerful air she put out her hand and entreated me to call on her the next day and inform her how the inquest progressed. I shall not attempt to disguise from you the fact that I spent all that long evening in going over the testimony given at the inquest, endeavouring to reconcile what I had heard with any other theory than that of Eleanor's guilt. Taking a piece of paper, I jotted down the leading causes of suspicion as follows: 1. Her late disagreement with her uncle, and evident estrangement from him, as testified to by Mr. Harwell. 2. The mysterious disappearance of one of the servants of the house. 3. The forcible accusation made by her cousin, overheard, however, only by Mr. Gryce and myself. 4. Her equivocation in regard to the handkerchief found stained with pistol smut on the scene of the tragedy. 5. Her refusal to speak in regard to the paper which she was supposed to have taken from Mr. Leavenworth's table immediately upon the removal of the body. 6. The finding of the library key in her possession. A dark record, I involuntarily decided as I looked it over, but even in doing so began jotting down on the other side of the sheet the following explanatory notes: 1. Disagreements and even estrangements between relatives are common. Cases where such disagreements and estrangements have led to crime, rare. 2. The disappearance of Hannah points no more certainly in one direction than another. 3. If Mary's private accusation of her cousin was forcible and convincing, her public declaration that she neither knew nor suspected who might be the author of this crime was equally so. To be sure, the former possessed the advantage of being uttered spontaneously, but it was likewise true that it was spoken under momentary excitement, without foresight of the consequences, and possibly without due consideration of the facts. 4. 5. An innocent man or woman, under the influence of terror, will often equivocate in regard to matters that seem to criminate them. But the key, what could I say to that? Nothing. With that key in her possession, and unexplained, Eleanor Leavenworth stood in an attitude of suspicion which even I felt forced to recognize. Brought to this point, I thrust the paper into my pocket and took up the Evening Express. Instantly my eye fell upon these words: "Shocking murder. Mr. Leavenworth, the well-known millionaire, found dead in his room. No clue to the perpetrator of the deed. The awful crime committed with a pistol. Extraordinary features of the affair." Ah, here at least was one comfort. Her name was not yet mentioned as that of a suspected party. But what might not the morrow bring? I thought of Mr. Gryce's expressive look as he handed me that key, and shuddered. "She must be innocent. She cannot be otherwise," I reiterated to myself, and then pausing, asked for what warranty I had of this. Only her beautiful face. Only her beautiful face. Abashed, I dropped the newspaper, and went downstairs just as a telegraph boy arrived with a message from Mr. Veeley. It was signed by the proprietor of the hotel at which Mr. Veeley was then stopping, and ran thus: Washington, D.C., Mr. Everett Raymond. Mr. Veeley is lying at my house ill. Have not shown him telegram, fearing results. Will do so as soon as advisable. Thomas Loworthy. I went in musing. Was this sudden sensation of relief on my part? Could it be that I had unconsciously been guilty of cherishing a latent dread of my senior's return? Why, who else could know so well the secret springs which govern this family? Who else could so effectually put me upon the right track? Was it possible that I, Everett Raymond, hesitated to know the truth in any case? No, that should never be said, and, sitting down again, I drew out the memoranda I had made, and, looking them carefully over, wrote against No. 6 the word suspicious in good round characters. There, do one could say, after that, I had allowed myself to be blinded by a bewitching face from seeing what, in a woman with no claims to comeliness, would be considered at once an almost indubitable evidence of guilt. And yet, after it was all done, I found myself repeating aloud as I gazed at it, "If she declares herself innocent, I will believe her." So completely are we the creatures of our own predilections. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. The Summons. The Pink of Courtesy. Romeo and Juliet. The morning papers contained a more detailed account of the murder than those of the evening before, but to my great relief in none of them was Eleanor's name mentioned in the connection I most dreaded. The final paragraph in the Times ran thus: "The detectives are upon the track of the missing girl Hannah," and in the Herald I read the following notice: "A liberal reward will be given by the relatives of Horatio Leavenworth, Esquire, deceased, for any news of the whereabouts of one Hannah Chester, disappeared from the house, 5th Avenue, since the evening of March the 4th. Said girl was of Irish extraction, in age about 25, and may be known by the following characteristics: form tall and slender, hair dark brown with a tinge of red, complexion fresh, features delicate and well made, hands small, but with the fingers much pricked by the use of the needle, feet large and of a coarser type than the hands. She had on, when last seen, a checked gingham dress, brown and white, and was supposed to have wrapped herself in a red and green blanket shawl, very old. Beside the above distinctive marks, she had upon her right hand wrist the scar of a large burn, also a pit or two of smallpox upon the left temple." This paragraph turned my thoughts in a new direction. Oddly enough, I had expended very little thought upon this girl, and yet how apparent it was that she was the one person upon whose testimony, if given, the whole case in reality hinged. I could not agree with those who considered her as personally implicated in the murder. An accomplice, conscious of what was before her, would have hid in her pockets whatever money she possessed, but the roll of bills found in Hannah's trunk proved her to have left too hurriedly for this precaution. On the other hand, if this girl had come unexpectedly upon the assassin at his work, how could she have been hustled from the house without creating a disturbance loud enough to have been heard by the ladies, one of whom had her door open? An innocent girl's first impulse upon such an occasion would have been to scream, and yet no scream was heard. She simply disappeared. What were we to think, then? That the person seen by her was one both known and trusted? I would not consider such a possibility, so, laying down the paper, I endeavoured to put away all further consideration of the affair till I had acquired more facts upon which to base the theory. But who can control his thoughts when over-excited upon any one theme? All the morning I found myself turning the case over in my mind, arriving ever at one of two conclusions. Hannah Chester must be found, or Eleanor Leavenworth must explain when and by what means the key of the library door came into her possession. At 2 o'clock I started from my office to attend the inquest, but being delayed on the way, missed arriving at the house until after the delivery of the verdict. This was a disappointment to me, especially as by these means I lost the opportunity of seeing Eleanor Leavenworth, she having retired to her room immediately upon the dismissal of the jury. But Mr. Harwell was visible, and from him I heard what the verdict had been. "Death by means of a pistol shot from the hand of some person unknown." The result of the inquest was a great relief to me. I had feared worse. Nor could I help seeing that, for all his studied self-command, the pale-faced secretary shared in my satisfaction. What was less of a relief to me was the fact, soon communicated, that Mr. Gryce and his subordinates had left the premises immediately upon the delivery of the verdict. Mr. Gryce was not the man to forsake an affair like this while anything of importance connected with it remained unexplained. Could it be he meditated any decisive action? Somewhat alarmed, I was about to hurry from the house for the purpose of learning what his intentions were, when a sudden movement in the front lower window of the house, on the opposite side of the way, arrested my attention, and looking closer, I detected the face of Mr. Fobbs peering out from behind the curtain. The sight assured me I was not wrong in my estimate of Mr. Gryce, and, struck with pity for the desolate girl, left to meet the exigencies of a fate to which this watch upon her movements was but the evident precursor, I stepped back and sent her a note, in which, as Mr. Veeley's representative, I proffered my services in case of any sudden emergency, saying I was always to be found in my rooms between the hours of 6 and 8. This done, I proceeded to the house in 37th Street where I had left Miss Mary Leavenworth the day before. Ushered into the long and narrow drawing-room which of late years has been so fashionable in our uptown houses, I found myself almost immediately in the presence of Miss Leavenworth. "Oh!" she cried, with an eloquent gesture of welcome, "I had begun to think I was forsaken." And advancing impulsively, she held out her hand. "What is the news from home?" "A verdict of murder, Miss Leavenworth." Her eyes did not lose their question. "Perpetrated by party or parties unknown." A look of relief broke softly across her features. "And they are all gone?" she exclaimed. "I found no one in the house who did not belong there." "Oh, then we can breathe easily again." I glanced hastily up and down the room. "There is no one here," said she. And still I hesitated. At length, in an awkward way enough, I turned towards her and said, "I do not wish either to offend or alarm you, but I must say that I consider it your duty to return to your own home to night." "Why?" she stammered. "Is there any particular reason for my doing so? Have you not perceived the impossibility of my remaining in the same house with Eleanor?" "Miss Leavenworth, I cannot recognize any so-called impossibility of this nature. Eleanor is your cousin, has been brought up to regard you as a sister. It is not worthy of you to desert her at the time of her necessity. You will see this as I do, if you will allow yourself a moment's dispassionate thought." "Dispassionate thought is hardly possible under the circumstances," she returned with a smile of bitter irony. But before I could reply to this, she softened and asked if I was very anxious to have her return, and when I replied, "More than I can say," she trembled and looked for a moment as if she were half inclined to yield, but suddenly broke into tears, crying it was impossible and that I was cruel to ask it. I drew back, baffled and sore. "Pardon me," said I. "I have indeed transgressed the bounds allotted to me. I will not do so again. You have doubtless many friends. Let some of them advise you." She turned upon me all fire. "The friends you speak of are flatterers. You alone have the courage to command me to do what is right." Excuse me, I do not command, I only entreat." She made no reply, but began pacing the room, her eyes fixed, her hands working convulsively. "You little know what you ask," said she. "I feel as though the very atmosphere of that house would destroy me, but why cannot Eleanor come here?" she impulsively inquired. "I know Mrs. Gilbert will be quite willing, and I could keep my room, and we need not meet." "You forget that there is another call at home, besides the one I have already mentioned. To-morrow afternoon your uncle is to be buried." "Oh, yes. Poor, poor uncle." "You are the head of the household," I now ventured, "and the proper one to attend to the final offices towards one who has done so much for you." There was something strange in the look which she gave me. "It is true," she assented. Then, with a grand turn of her body and a quick air of determination, "I am desirous of being worthy of your good opinion. I will go back to my cousin, Mr. Raymond." I felt my spirits rise a little. I took her by the hand. "May that cousin have no need of the comfort which I am now sure you will be ready to give her." Her hand dropped from mine. "I mean to do my duty," was her cold response. As I descended the stoop, I met a certain thin and fashionably dressed young man, who gave me a very sharp look as he passed. As he wore his clothes a little too conspicuously for the perfect gentleman, and as I had some remembrance of having seen him at the inquest, I set him down for a man in Mr. Gryce's employ, and hasted on towards the avenue, when what was my surprise to find on the corner another person, who, while pretending to be on the lookout for a car, cast upon me, as I approached, a furtive glance of intense inquiry. As this latter was, without question, a gentleman, I felt some annoyance, and, walking quietly up to him, asked if he found my countenance familiar, that he scrutinized it so closely. "I find it a very agreeable one," was his unexpected reply, as he turned from me and walked down the avenue. Nettled, and in no small degree mortified at the disadvantage in which his courtesy had placed me, I stood watching him as he disappeared, asking myself who and what he was. For he was not only a gentleman, but a marked one, possessing features of unusual symmetry as well as a form of peculiar elegance. Not so very young, he might well be 40. There were yet evident on his face the impress of youth's strongest emotions, not a curve of his chin nor a glance of his eye betraying in any way the slightest leaning towards ennui, though face and figure were of that type which seems most to invite and cherish it. He can have no connection with the police force, thought I, nor is it by any means certain that he knows me or is interested in my affairs, but I shall not soon forget him for all that. The summons from Eleanor Leavenworth came about 8 o'clock in the evening. It was brought by Thomas, and read as follows: "Come, oh come, I—" there breaking off in a tremble, as if the pen had fallen from a nerveless hand. It did not take me long to find my way to her home.
Right. So I think we can all agree that these two women have an odd relationship. Yes, they do. They also have, well, one of them has a bit of a problem, because no matter what she has done, she only seems to make herself look that much more guilty. Nothing, perhaps, more so than the key, which, if you've taken a look at the art that I did for the button for this book, you will notice that one of the keys has a broken handle. Dun, dun, da, da. I know, right? Because I read the book before we did this. All right, so Key is actually Key, and Hannah, only one being mentioned in the papers. A couple little snarky moments about the Irish. Again, if it's not the Irish, it's going to be the Jews, so we've got one or the other. Unfortunately, this time it was the Irish. Lots of Mary weird behavior. And then at the very end of chapter 11, Eleanor needs Mr. Raymond to come to her. I loved the scene with Mr. Gryce talking to the inkstand and Mr. Raymond saying, I had this feeling that if I just ran over there and checked on it, I would learn so much. Mr. Gryce is a character. I really love him. There's also this question of the gentleman who, as Mr. Raymond is leaving, I think it's Miss Gilbert's, Mary's friend's home, he sees this guy crossing paths with him, and he's handsome and kind of conspicuously so. And Mr. Raymond is having a little, you want a piece of me? Staring contest with him, and then says, walking quietly up to him, I asked if he found my countenance familiar, since he scrutinized it so closely. What? You got a problem? You looking at me? What's up? And the guy comes back with, yes, I find it a very agreeable one. Yeah, you're pretty good looking, guy. Whatever. And now Mr. Raymond's really frustrated because he got one-upped. And he didn't get any information. He doesn't know who this guy is or why he would have been staring so hard at Mr. Raymond. And so now Mr. Raymond's just like, whoa, arms flailing. What do I do now? I loved that moment. That is such a human, modern moment. That's just beautiful. So every once in a while, we'll get one of those moments in this book, and they are just gems. Just gems. All right. I think that's everything I had for you. We will have more fun next week. You take care of yourself, take care of each other, wear a mask, get a vaccine. I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.